The small town of Point Pleasant was nestled deep within the West Virginian woods, where every night the thick, hanging fog wrapped its cold fingers around the winding roads. It was a quiet place, more comfortable with silence than noise. But as the people of Point Pleasant would soon learn, some silences hid secrets better left undiscovered. It began with a scream in the dead of night. Evelyn Carter, a local high school teacher, was driving home from a late dinner with friends. Her headlights barely cut through the thick fog, her eyes strained from watching the road. As she rounded a sharp curve by the abandoned TNT plant on the outskirts of town, a chill ran down her spine. A pair of glowing red eyes pierced the darkness in her rearview mirror. The eyes blinked, and she could swear they grew closer. Evelyn's heart hammered as she pressed her foot down on the accelerator, the car picking up speed. She gripped the wheel so hard her knuckles turned white, refusing to look back. But it was too late. The thing was hovering above her, large and dark, with wings that stretched out impossibly wide. She could hear it, the sound of wings cutting through the air, an inhuman screech that drilled into her skull. Suddenly, it was gone. Evelyn's car jerked back onto the road as she realized she'd been drifting toward the guardrail. Trembling, she pulled over, gasping for breath, and searched the night with desperate eyes. Nothing. Just silence. But when she finally reached home, her front porch light was shattered, glass littering the steps like scattered stars. And on her car's dusty rear windshield, there were 2 handprints, smeared and bloody. The unease in Point Pleasant grew after Evelyn's encounter, but true fear gripped the town when Evan, a local fisherman known for his stories and strength, went missing. He had been out by the riverbank, alone, setting his traps like he did every night. But this night was different. That night, something was watching him. Evan's wife, Mary, woke up at dawn, realizing he hadn't come home. Panic gnawed at her as she paced the living room, dialing his cell only to hear it ring out into the hollow silence. She threw on her coat and hurried to the river, hoping to see him pulling his boat ashore, smiling that lopsided grin she loved. But when she arrived, her heart froze. There, lying sprawled across the riverbank, was Evan's body. His mouth was open in a silent scream, his eyes wide, staring blankly into the gray sky. His hands were clawed, frozen in an upward grasp as if he'd been reaching out to fight or beg. The police arrived quickly, doing what they could to calm Mary down and promising to look into it. But even they could barely bring themselves to look at Evan's face. He looked as if he'd seen something horrific, something no one should ever see. Doctors would later call it a heart attack, citing his age and possible health complications. But anyone who had known Evan could feel a tremor of something darker. When they brought his body back, the town coroner, a man who'd seen his share of strange cases, was rattled. Examining Evan's arms and chest, he found scratches, faint but deep enough to break the skin, almost like claw marks. But stranger still were the small bruises forming around his wrists, as though bony, inhuman hands had gripped him with an unholy force. The coroner would never admit it aloud, but the thought crept into his mind and stuck like a thorn. Evan had been pulled by something far beyond human. After Evan's death, strange things began happening all over town. Doors creaked open in the middle of the night, pets went missing, and in the woods near the river, people whispered that they'd heard faint screeches that echoed on the wind, chilling them to the core. And then came the sightings. One night, a group of teens decided to wander near the riverbank, daring each other to go as far as Evan's last spot. They clutched their flashlights and laughed to hide their fear, but as they got closer, their voices died down. A feeling of heavy, unnatural dread descended over them, chilling the night air. They huddled together, scanning the darkness. And that's when they saw it. A pair of red eyes blinked open in the shadows, staring right at them from across the river. The teens froze, feeling a suffocating sense of fear, as if something was forcing its way into their minds, paralyzing them with terror. One of them whispered, "We need to go, now." But their legs wouldn't move, as if the ground itself was trapping them in place. The figure stepped closer to the water's edge, and they could finally make out its shape, an impossibly tall, human-like figure with large, shadowy wings folded tightly against its back. Its face was hidden in the darkness, but the red eyes burned into their souls, imprinting its image in their minds forever. In a sudden, terrible burst, the creature let out a shriek, a cry that was neither animal nor human, a sound that tore through the night and filled every inch of silence. The teens snapped out of their paralysis and bolted, sprinting back to town, their hearts racing, the creature's scream still echoing in their heads. By the next day, they could barely bring themselves to talk about it, but whispers circulated around town. It was clear now that something dark was lurking in Point Pleasant, and it had no intention of leaving. It was no longer just the Mothman, it was something darker, something that came to feed on fear, and the town was powerless to stop it. It was a chilly November night, and the whole town gathered around the church's yard to celebrate the fall harvest. Fires crackled, children laughed, and warm cider was passed around. For a brief moment, Point Pleasant felt normal, safe. But then, as the flames danced and sparks flew, a strange hush fell over the crowd. It was as if every sound had been sucked out of the air. The children stopped laughing, mothers clutched their babies closer, and all eyes turned to the sky. There, standing on the top of the old church steeple, was a figure. Tall, dark, with wings so vast they seemed to blot out the stars. Its red eyes glowed, watching them, piercing each soul with a haunting stare that froze blood in veins. The Mothman. People screamed, dropping their cups and stumbling backward, but the Mothman stayed silent. With a sudden burst, it leaped from the steeple, its wings catching the air as it swooped low over the terrified crowd. The wind from its wings blew out the bonfire, plunging them all into darkness. Only the red glow of its eyes remained, flickering like embers in the night. Panic surged. People scattered, grabbing their children and shoving their way to their cars. Some fell, others tripped, and in the chaos, no one noticed Evelyn Carter, standing at the edge of the crowd, her eyes glazed, her lips murmuring something soft and incoherent. By morning, Evelyn was gone, and her house stood abandoned. Her car was found at the edge of the river, empty, with the doors wide open. On the hood, scratched into the metal, were two letters, M.M. The town held its breath, waiting, expecting something worse. Weeks passed, and the stories slowly faded. People went back to their lives, pretending they'd never seen the Mothman, that it was all some shared hallucination. But the river continued to carry a faint, eerie mist, and some claimed they could still see red eyes glowing in the distance on foggy nights.